Welcome to part 2 of our set review for Knights of the Frozen Throne. In part 2, I'm going to review the final 5 classes, and in doing so, I will use the same review system that I used for the first 4 classes. So if you're curious to see what the different ratings mean for power and for versatility, go ahead and check out our video in part 1, where I go in depth to explain how I go about choosing the numbers for my rating system. Alright, let's dive in. Our first class today is Priest, which means our first card, of course, will be our new Death Knight, Shadow Reaper Anduin. The battle cry ability on this one is probably my least favorite battle cry of the group. It destroys all minions with 5 or more attack. This might not necessarily be good on many boards, and it could even destroy your own minions. So I think to make up for this, the ability needs to be pretty strong on its hero power, and I think it is. I think it's pretty reasonable to expect that you're going to be able to cast at least one spell and therefore be able to use the hero power twice per turn. And 4 damage per turn is pretty strong. That can kill relatively large minions. It can apply a lot of pressure. So I think that if you're playing this into a already stable board, this will be a pretty decent finisher. So perhaps in decks like the Highlander Priest, or in control decks which can afford to, play other board clear spells and other effects which will stabilize the game, I think they can look to use this card to kind of close things out. Though it's definitely worth noting that surrendering your ability to heal means that this card is probably not going to be very strong when you're behind, unless, of course, your opponent has a board with several minions with 5 or more attack on it. So I don't expect Shadow Reaper Anduin to have a tremendous effect on the metagame, but I do think this card will show up in some control. Our next card is a card that I'm very glad exists. I think it's a cool effect, and I'm glad that the developers are willing to try to put something like this into the game because it's fun, but that's really all I think it is. It's just fun. You don't want to be drawing your opponent's deck unless it's the strangest of circumstances, and the body on this card is not nearly powerful enough to warrant its mana cost. So unless something very, very strange happens in the metagame, I don't think you ever want to put this card into your deck. Next up, we have a big boy here, Obsidian Statue. It's got 8 health, Taunt, Lifesteal, and Death Rattle. That's a lot of stuff going on, but it does cost 9 mana. So the question is it worth it to play this card? Well, the fact that it has Taunt and Lifesteal means that if you're going to spend a whole lot of mana on this, at least you're likely not to die immediately unless your opponent has some kind of silence effect, because if they're attacking into this, you're likely to gain at least 8 life, and it takes probably 2 or more minions to kill this on a normal board. And then the Death Rattle effect will also kill one of their minions when it's done. So I think this card's pretty likely to trade for at least a few cards on most boards. Obviously, at 9, it does not go into every style of Priest deck, but I do think this is a card that's going to see some play in control decks, and it does have a very powerful effect on the game. Embrace Darkness is like a little version of Mind Control, but I think it's quite a bit worse than Mind Control. If you're playing this into a board where you already have some minions, this just incentivizes your opponent to trade the minion that you would be stealing into your minion. And if you're playing this into an empty board, then you're already behind and you're giving your opponent one more turn to kind of beat you up a little bit before you steal what they have. When it does work, it is a 2-for-1. Stealing a minion is a pretty powerful effect, but I just think that you're asking a little bit too much when you look at the cost of the card itself, as well as the setup it takes to have this work. This is a card I am extremely excited about. Let me tell you why. So Eternal Servitude discovers a friendly minion that has died this game. And generally one of the weaknesses that Priest has is that they're very powerful minions. They need them to stay in play for them to have an effect. So if you think about Lyra the Sun Shard, this card's not getting you any battle cry effects. This card is not getting you end of turn effects. It's good when you do stuff. Same with Prophet Velen. It doubles damage, it doubles healing. So the issue with these cards is you generally can't play them and then pass the turn because you will expect them to die. But with Eternal Servitude, you can play them and pass the turn and then get them back and do some really busted stuff. You could 20 someone with a Prophet Velen with 2 Mind Blasts. You could play Lyra on turn 5, then play Radiant Elemental or 2, and then play Eternal Servitude follow-up and just start comboing off. So I think this increases the consistency quite a bit of the priest decks, and it's also just an excellent top deck in the late game to try to help you find some answers. So I think this is the most powerful card of the new cards for priest, and I think this is a big upgrade for the class. Devour Mind is a 5-mana draw 3, which has precedence as a good card. You know, people play Kabbalist's Tome, people play Nourish, but the difference between this and those cards is that Devour Mind is drawing cards from your opponent's deck, whereas the other cards are drawing cards that are either in your deck or, at the very least, are guaranteed to belong to your class. So the issue I see with Devour Mind is that I'm just not sure where you would want it. Clearly, this would go into a more controlling or potentially a mid-range deck, but the issue is that this is just terrible against aggro because you don't want to be drawing aggro cards, and it's probably only good against other control decks. So I guess if there is a control-heavy meta where you expect to be playing against a lot of control decks, then a 5-mana draw 3 that draws you 3 potentially controlling cards is probably going to be pretty good. But in any kind of more mid-range or aggressive heavy meta, I don't think this is going to be a very good card. Shadow Essence has a very interesting and powerful effect, and its fail case is really not that bad. You'll just give you a 6-mana 5/5. But I think to actually want to play this card, you're going to have to impose a few deck building restrictions on yourself. You'd want to play this with Death Rattle cards, or cards that have very powerful end-of-turn effects, in which case I think this could be pretty good, but at that point, it just becomes a Shadow Essence deck. You're not going to want to grab a Cabal Talon Priest or a Radiant Elemental, which are cards that see play in most Priest decks right now. So I think that this does force you to play a certain style of deck, which might not be as powerful if you don't get to play Shadow Essence as if you had just played a normal strategy. This was a card that when I saw it spoiled and was reading the comments, a lot of people were confused as to why you wouldn't just play Earthen Ring Farseer and get a Battlecry heal 3, as opposed to having to do a bunch of work to heal 3. Well, to those people, I would say that you're probably underestimating the power of Lifesteal. When you look at the Priest class as a whole, most decks already are playing Power Word Shield and Cabal Talon Priest, and if you're giving extra health to this minion and can use your hero power to heal it, and then attack and heal 3, and instead of using your hero power on yourself and healing for 2, I think this could get out of hand pretty quickly against a lot of aggro decks. So this seems like a great tool against aggro. I don't expect it to be the best card in Priest decks, but I do expect it to play a role. So don't be afraid to try out this card in existing sort of, very normal or run-of-the-mill Priest decks to see what it can do for you. Spirit Lash is a card which I think has a lot more play to it than people might be seeing. So first of all, if you play this on any kind of big board, it's going to gain you a substantial amount of life. The other thing that I see this doing is it works in combination with Northshire Cleric and Circle of Healing, because it deals 1 damage to all minions. So if you have 5 minions on board, Spirit Lash, Northshire Cleric, and Circle of Healing means you're drawing 5 cards. People already kind of go out of their way to play Wild Pyromancer and Acolyte of Pain to draw a lot of cards in certain Priest decks, and I think Spirit Lash might just be able to take out the middleman of Wild Pyromancer and go directly more to the source, I guess, as it were. I think this is going to be great against aggro, but it's not particularly strong against mid-range and control decks. So I do expect to see this card. I don't expect to see it all over the place. Our last Priest card is a card which doesn't really seem like it was meant for Priest at all. It's a fairly aggressive card. If you go 1-drop into 2-drop and you immediately get an effect off of this, it's pretty strong. Or if you go this into, say, Cabal Talon Priest, that also seems pretty good if it survives for the turn. But Priest doesn't really have an aggro deck. You'd probably have to rely on a lot of neutral minions to be able to do that. And in looking at the neutral minions in this set, I don't think there's enough of them to create a dedicated aggro Priest deck. So I'm not really sure where this fits into. I think it's very powerful. It's probably going to be a very high pick in the arena, but I'm not sure that there will be a home for it in Constructed. I do like its effect. My only concern is, where does it go? Priest is a class that definitely got a few clunkers this time around, but it also got some really good new cards. The commons are particularly strong, and Eternal Servitude was the only card in my entire set review to get 5 stars for power and for versatility. I would expect that Priest gets a bump up, but I am not sure that they're going to create any new archetypes as a result of these cards. The only new archetype I could potentially see is a Shadow Essence deck, but I wouldn't anticipate that being quite as powerful as a more standard mid-range or controlling priest strategy. Perhaps the Highlander decks do get an uptick thanks to the late-game power of Shadow Reaper Anduin and a few more playable cards, but other than that, I would expect to kind of see more of the same old priest going forward. So there is a lot going on here with Valeera the Hollow, so let me kind of step through you a little bit with this one. So first of all, the Battlecry ability says you gain stealth. That's right, it means that you cannot be attacked for the next turn. So in the criteria I'm looking for how much does this protect you the turn you play it, well, pretty much perfectly. You can't be damaged until the turn after this, which means you are setting yourself up for a future turn to do something more powerful. So there's very little downside to playing this card. The only downside is that you have to include a 9-drop in your deck and that it might sit around for a little while. So what's the upside? Why would you play this card other than to gain 5 armor? Well, I would say it's probably pretty good to upgrade what's one of the weakest hero powers in the entire game into Death's Shadow. So what Death's Shadow does is it basically draws you a card for free each turn, and this card is called Shadow Reflection. So whenever you play a card, Shadow Reflection becomes that card. So if you play a Backstab, Shadow Reflection is now Backstab. There you go. This seems pretty good for Miracle Rogue. To be able to double down on certain effects seems quite strong, especially if you're trying to combo off. Doubling down on Jade cards seems really good. This could even just see play as a value card in mid-range decks because you'll basically be drawing an extra card per turn for the rest of the game. The only turns where you're not drawing an extra card are where you're empty-handed and draw something off the top, which costs 6 or more. So all things considered, when you put this all together, I think Valeera is a very, very powerful card. I would expect her to see play in certain decks. I cannot guarantee that she will be good in Miracle or Jade, but those would be the first 2 decks that I would think to try her out in. And if there's any kind of more controlling deck for Rogue coming up in this metagame, she would definitely find a home in there as well. Lillian Voss was a card that I really didn't like on first glance, but the more that I look at it, the more that I think this card might see some play. So first of all, it's a 4-mana 4/5, which is pretty good stats. That's a Chillwind Yeti right there. And when you look at its Battlecry effect, it might seem like a downside, but I think there are some decks where this will actually be an upside. So if this is a downside in your deck, if you have a very focused thing going on where you don't want to get rid of your spells, then yes, you do not want this card. But in a deck which might already be heavy on steal effects, such as Hallucinate, then I think you might be interested in this card. It gets a lot better if you play like Razor Petal Volley, or those cards that add a Razor Petal to your hand, because it can just turn those 2 relatively small impact spells into potentially high impact ones. So I think this is a card that will end up seeing some play, but it certainly does not have widespread application. Spectral Pillager is just a miss for me. It costs 6 mana, which is quite a lot for rogue decks that are looking to play a lot of spells in one turn, and I think for this to be worth it, you want to be getting at least 4 cards in, and this is perhaps possible if you already had a Gadget Zan Auctioneer survive from a previous turn, but I don't think it's very likely. I think this is more likely to sit in your hand, and its best use is probably to generate extra dust to build some better cards. Doomerang is a huge flavor win. It has great art, very, very cool name, but I think it's going to be a bit of a fail when it comes to actually seeing play in Standard. It just requires too much work to actually set up. There's some neat stuff with it, because the way it's worded, you can actually give Poisonous to your weapon with Envenom Weapon, or Lifesteal with a card that we'll be seeing soon, and that will work with Doomerang. But I think it just requires too much work to be an effective card, and I'm not sure that there's a rogue deck that would even want an effect like this anyways. Runeforge Hunter is another weapon-focused card. We're going to have several of them coming up. It has a decent stat line, and it has a decent ability, but I think the 2 decent things combined don't make it enough of a card to actually be worth playing. I think it either needed to have a larger effect on your weapons, something more tangible like adding more damage to them, or this would have to have a better body for me to actually want to have to play this card. Shadowblade is a card that's worth getting excited about. We've seen cards a lot like this before. Paladin and Hunter have a 3-mana 3/2 weapon, and both of those classes play those cards, even if they can't get any effects out of the text box. But the text box on Shadowblade is quite relevant. To not take damage the first turn that you attack with this weapon is pretty good. You won't get an advantage out of the Battlecry effect if you're playing this after you'd already attacked with a different weapon, or playing it in anticipation of playing another weapon, even if you don't have a good target. But I think that's fine. This is a playable card even without the Battlecry effect on it. We've seen that from other classes, and I think any mid-range style rogue deck is going to want this one. Roll the Bones is a firm pass for me. I think you would need to have at least a 90 or a 95% chance that this would draw 2 cards for this to be playable, and the chances that you could build your deck such that you could offer a 90 or 95% chance of drawing 2 cards off of this are just way too low. Just stick to Mimic Bot and leave this one out of your new brews. Leeching Poison is another pretty firm pass for me. This would have to go in a very dedicated weapons deck. If you just play this on your hero power weapon, you're only going to gain 2 life for the cost of a card. So I think this card is pretty awful, and I am not looking to put it into any of my decks. Bone Baron is an interesting one because it has good stats and a good death rattle ability. The question is if those two things combined make it enough to be playable. I think if there's a pretty dedicated mid-range deck, like a true mid-range strategy in Rogue, which they don't really have right now, then Bone Baron could see play in that deck as a 5-drop. But as things stand right now, rogue decks tend to be very highly focused, and unless they have a card that's really going into their focused game plan, they're probably not interested in this one. So we'll wait and see if Bone Baron actually ends up seeing play, but it is powerful enough, I think, to fit into some strategies. And last is Plague Scientist, which is another card kind of like Bone Baron insofar as that it really wants to be in a mid-range deck. I don't think this is good enough in more focused decks like Jade or Miracle, but I think if your plan is to just play efficient creatures and try to outvalue your opponent, Plague Scientist is going to do a pretty good job at that. This would allow you to trade something like a Jade Swarmer into a much larger minion, and anything that's a 2-for-1 is exactly what a mid-range deck wants. So if mid-range is good, I think that Plague Scientist is going to be pretty good. But if mid-range is bad, then I think Plague Scientist is going to be pretty bad. Overall, I am not particularly impressed with the changes that we have seen to Rogue. They did pick up Shadowblade, which is a card I think we're going to see all over the place, and I do think that Valera is very powerful. But outside of that, the cards are kind of all over the place. There's a few Death Rattle-oriented cards, there's a few weapon-oriented cards, and there's a few cards that seem like they really want to be in a mid-range deck. So a lot of those cards could end up not seeing play at all if they're not able to unseat some of the more powerful Rogue strategies, such as Miracle and Jade. So we'll see if anything other than Shadowblade and Valera ends up seeing play. I think Lillian might end up seeing some play in the Steel decks, but I'm not terribly optimistic about a lot of these cards' chances of making an impact. So the best deck coming out of the Ungoro metagame was Evolve Shaman, and I don't think that's going to change thanks to our new friend Thrall Deathseer. As his Battlecry trigger, he basically casts Evolve twice, and his hero power is a mini-evolve that works on just 1 minion. So I think in that Evolve deck, if you're playing things like Doppelgangsters and Aya Blackpaw and Jade Golems and things from the below, you're going to be really happy with this guy. He's going to be great. I think he's going to be good in decks that establish presence on the board early, that go wide on turns 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then would like to evolve their already established board into larger minions. I do not think he, however, goes into the more mid-range or controlling Shaman decks, as in these decks, his effect on the game just isn't quite large enough, and the upgrade in hero power that you're getting is likely to be questionable at best in a deck that's a little more synergy focused, perhaps. He's quite a bit different from the other Death Knights in that his job is really not to kind of stabilize the board or catch you up if you're behind and take over as the game goes long. He's really kind of more like a spell almost, kind of like a Bloodlust or something like that, which is to say that in the right deck, I think he's going to be really good. Our legendary Shaman minion for the class is Murabi, who will clearly go into the Freeze deck, which we'll see more cards for coming up soon. But unfortunately, I think the Freeze deck is just going to miss the mark when it comes to Shaman. So I don't think this card is going to have a home, because I don't think the Freeze deck is going to be good. But even if the Freeze deck was good, I think you're going to have to jump through a few hoops to make this guy a playable card. If he only copies one minion of your choice on board and adds it to your hand, I think this is passable. And if he copies two, it's great. But if you just play this and you don't really have a follow-up and he dies, you're going to feel pretty bad about it. So overall, I'm going to pass on Murabi. This is not a card that I'm looking to try to build a deck around. Our first epic is Snow Fury Giant, which gets added to the long list of giants who are an 8/8 and have a mana reduction effect. The first very relevant thing about this card is that for evolve and devolve effects, you now have something connecting 10 and 12. So you can evolve your 8/8s that have been damaged into a new 8/8 that is undamaged, or if you're looking to devolve a 8/8 into a smaller one, it's just going to become a new 8/8 that has more health. So anyways, how good is this card? How easy is it to overload your mana crystals and therefore get a benefit out of this? Well, I think this is quite passable if you can overload 5 mana crystals. To do that, you're likely to have to play at least 3 or 4 cards. And this card is really good if you can get it under that, but then you're starting to look at quite a few overload cards. Traditionally, these effects have been pretty good. I think this one is a little harder to set up than some of the other ones, though. So I'm cautiously optimistic about this card. It's definitely one worth trying out because mana reduction effects have typically been so powerful, but I don't expect this one to take the metagame by storm. Cryostasis is a very interesting card because if the text were to end at just give a minion +3/+3, this would arguably be the best card in the entire set. But of course, the text does not stop there. It also says freeze the minion. So how are we going to use this? Are we going to use it on our opponent's stuff to try to get some sort of freeze payoff? Well, I think as we'll see later, there is one card that allows us to kill frozen minions with Shaman, but trying to use Cryostasis on it is going to require a little bit too much setup, and as we'll see, it's a weapon, so it will also hurt us even more. So I think that's a pass. You might use it to not die for a single turn, but that application seems fairly limited because you'll also be buffing it up in future turns, and this is likely not going to want to be a removal spell. So this means we would have to want to use it on our own minion. So when is that good? When are we okay freezing our own minion to give it +3/+3? Well, I think we could throw this on a taunt minion, and then the taunt can become pretty threatening. If we're not planning on putting in a lot of damage to that anyways and just being defensive, maybe that could be pretty good. Overall, though, I think this card requires a little bit too much setup, and is not quite flexible enough to be very powerful, but at the same time, 2 mana, give a minion +3/+3 is very strong, so I wouldn't be surprised if there was a way to break this card. Whether or not the freeze deck is any good, I do not think will matter to Voodoo Hexer. This card seems excellent. We know from Ali Armorsmith how much a 5 mana 2/7 can do with Taunt, and I think the ability to freeze anything that you touch as opposed to gain 2 armor whenever you deal damage is actually quite a bit better. Being able to go to the face of a warrior that has a big weapon is a really big game. Stalling enemy boards for a long time seems very good. I think that both mid-range and controlling strategies are going to be quite interested in this card, and I would expect to see it around a lot. Avalanche strikes me as a very solid card. It does not seem broken, it does not seem busted, but it also does not seem weak. I think it seems fairly costed, and I think it'll see a good amount of play. This will slot more into mid-rangey and controlling strategies. I don't think this is efficient enough for aggro, but in those decks, I think it's going to be pretty efficient. To be able to kill 1 minion to this feels really good, because at the same time you'll also be stalling what is hopefully a quite large minion, and if you ever get 2 cards off of this, that's just awesome. I would expect to see this card around quite a bit, but I would not expect it to completely change the landscape of the metagame. Next up is Icebreaker, which is one of the 2 payoffs other than Murabi for being in a dedicated freeze deck. This was the weapon I was talking about earlier when I alluded to Cryostasis. This is part of the reason why I think the freeze deck will not be a thing. Icebreaker is kind of underwhelming to me. Obviously, if you're able to kill 3 things with this, it would be really good, but it's just going to take a lot of work in the Shaman deck to be able to consistently freeze minions, and I think this is going to sit around not accumulating as much value as other 3-drops or as other weapons such as Jade Claws. So I don't expect the freeze deck to make a splash, and I think that might be in large part due to the relative unplayability of Icebreaker. Birdlock is a card that does not compare very favorably to Glacial Shard, which is a 1 mana 2/1. Getting an extra point of toughness for the same ability does not really make it worth an extra mana. With that said, it is a Murloc, which is perhaps the most important creature type in the entire game, because Murlocs are very, very synergy dependent. So I think in a dedicated Murloc deck, this does make the cut. It's likely to be good enough because freezing a minion and stapling it onto a body that is passable in a Murloc deck is going to be good enough. So I wouldn't expect to see this played in a average deck, but I do think it will make the cut in Murloc. Our other Murloc card is really, really, really good. Of course, it only really makes sense in Murloc decks, but if you're in a Murloc deck, this is exactly what you want. I think despite the fact that Murloc decks tend to be pretty aggressive, 2-mana draw 2s are just good enough that you're going to just want to auto-include this in every Murloc deck under the sun. This brings us to our final Shaman card of the set and only Overload card for our new Giant. It is Drakari Defender. 2/8 is a lot of stats, but 6 mana is a lot of mana, and I don't think splitting up 6 mana over 2 turns is enough to justify the cost that you're paying on this card. I think this might be a plant to try to lower the cost of the new Giant, but I don't think it's going to do enough on its own to warrant play. Perhaps in an Overload deck it might work a little bit, but other than that, I don't think most decks are going to want this card. So my thoughts on Shaman are that most of these new cards here seem to be wasted on a freeze archetype, which doesn't seem to be powerful enough to find any play on its own. Murloc did pick up 2 nice new toys, and I think Thrall Deathseer is going to be an excellent addition to the existing Evolved deck, but the bulk of these cards are a little too focused on a strategy, which just doesn't seem good enough. This brings us to Warlock, which was the weakest class in Journey to Ungoro, so one would hope that we're going to get a bit of an upgrade to the class coming into Knights of the Frozen Throne. But unfortunately, I don't think we're going to get that from its Death Knight card. As we can see here with Gul'dan, he costs 10, so automatically he only fits into control decks just because of his cost. Does his Battlecry trigger afford you to take a turn off to play him? Well, if your deck has a good number of demons in it, it does, but the problem with demons is that there aren't a lot of highly defensive ones. The only demon that has taunt and is sizable is Lucari Fellhound, but that only fits into a discard deck. So when I started doing some digging around to see, okay, what kind of demons might go into a playable deck, what I really found was that I think this card wants to be in a controlling discard deck, perhaps in addition to the quest, where you would just overwhelm them with value either from the quest or from the hero power on Gul'dan. I don't think that the average deck is going to really be interested in Gul'dan, despite the fact that the upgraded hero power is very, very strong. To be able to deal 3 damage to any target is really good, but I think you're going to have to get a little value from your Battlecry trigger to make it worth it the cost of a card and an entire turn of 10 mana to be able to play this card. I just don't see that happening outside of discard decks. So I think inside that deck, controlling discard deck that maybe runs the quest, that this card could be good, but outside of that, I'm not very optimistic about Gul'dan's chances of impacting the metagame. As soon as Lifesteal was announced in the new set, I immediately hoped that a Lifesteal card would be added to Warlock. I'm a little disappointed that it's coming as a legendary and not as a card that you can play 2 of in your deck, but I think that Warlock is going to be quite happy with this one, especially if the aforementioned controlling / discard / demon / quest deck that I was just talking about is any good at all. Blood Queen Lanethel is going to be a linchpin in that one. To be able to draw cards, Warlock has to life tap, and to life tap, Warlock has to have life. So any card that can turn after turn threaten to gain life for the Warlock is just very, very powerful. I think you're going to be happy with this card in Warlock decks if you've discarded just 2 cards. If this is a 5-mana 3/6 lifesteal, I think you're going to be satisfied with it in most situations. The other thing to keep in mind if you're worried about discarding it is that you can play this card and then discard stuff and it will still get bigger later. So I do think that we're going to see a bit of Blood Queen Lanethel if Warlock does end up seeing some play, but I'm a little disappointed that she's only going to fit into discard decks. Treachery is a cute card, which combos with some very, very bad cards, which we're going to be seeing soon. But I think it's just a little bit too much work to play a minion that's bad just to be able to give it to your opponent at the cost of a card. To do this, you have to fill your deck with bad cards, and then hope to draw Treachery to make these bad cards useful at all. So I just don't think that a Treachery deck is where you want to be. Next up is a card that the community seemed to be quite excited about when it was announced, but I really don't think this one is going to make much of an impact. As a 2-mana 2/3, it's not embarrassing to play on its stats alone, but to play a 2-mana 2/3 in Constructed, I think it's going to need to have a pretty decent effect on the game, and removing a card from the top of your opponent's deck is not a very strong effect. I realize that it could potentially hit like a very key card in something like a Quest Mage deck or potentially a Death Knight card, and then you would feel good about it, but it's just as likely to hit a bad card that your opponent didn't want to draw as it would be to hit a good card. It's a random card. There is nothing in the game which puts cards on top of your opponent's deck or in any order in your opponent's deck. You're literally just removing a random card from your opponent's deck. And I think that the chances that that will have a positive impact on the game are simply not high enough to warrant this card's inclusion in the average deck. Defile is a card which has a relatively high floor and a very high ceiling. If you can use this to set up a scenario where your opponents have an ascending amount of health, like 2, 3, 4, 5, then for 2 mana you could wipe an entire board, which is really, really, really good. The number of times you'll be able to do that are relatively low, but I think even if you aren't killing multiple cards with this, just to kill one card with this is great, and at the same time it's dealing damage to the rest of your enemy minions as well. Of course, it will deal damage to your own minions, but sometimes that's actually going to be a positive, because it might be able to turn on the trigger which casts this spell again when a minion dies, if you're able to use your own minion to set up that sort of chain of ascending health. So I think Defile is a card that's going to see a lot of play. It's going to be an important anti-aggro tool, and it's going to be a card that has a lot of really interesting play to it and some fun play patterns, which I'm excited to try out. Our next rare is what I think is going to be another playable one for Warlock. As a 5-mana 4/5, it doesn't need to have a super strong ability to be playable, it just needs a good one. But I think this ability is more than good. 1 damage to all enemy minions at the end of each turn. If that happens like twice or 3 times, this card has more than paid for itself. I think even if it only happens once, which it is guaranteed to happen, it's still going to be pretty good. If you get 2 of these guys out at the same time, you're going to be very happy about it. And I think another key thing is that it's a demon for the Death Knight Gul'dan. So when you put all these things together, I think you get a pretty solid card. I don't think it's going to be the card that saves Warlock on its own, but if Warlock is going to become playable in Knights of the Frozen Throne, I think this will be a part of it. Unwilling Sacrifice is another card kind of like Treachery, which I think will require you to put some bad cards into your deck to facilitate it being a powerful card. I mean, the obvious place to go with this is to run some eggs that have powerful Death Rattle triggers and kill those to destroy an enemy minion, but I think we're going to see that there are better ways to trigger that with another card, and it's a little bit of an expensive effect to destroy a random enemy minion. I think if this destroyed a targeted enemy minion, it might be a little too powerful, but as is, I'm not very interested in putting this into my sacrifice-oriented decks. Drain Soul is not a particularly flashy card, but I think this is a card which you're going to see a lot of. Any deck which is interested in removing enemy minions, which as far as I know it is the vast majority of them, is going to want to play this, because just casting this enables you to life tap one more time. It might not be super powerful, but I think the life gain is important enough to Warlock that they're going to want to run this card in a variety of decks. Hellfiend seems really, really bad. The stats on it are obviously pretty good for 3 mana, but if you discard more than 1 card from this, I think you're going to be quite unhappy, and that seems pretty likely since it has 6 health. My first thought was that maybe this goes in like a Treachery deck, but I think that Treachery decks are pretty bad, and to spend 2 cards to give your opponent this card just does not really seem where I want to be. I could envision a scenario where you discard a Clutch Mother Zavos over and over again to this, but it just seems way too much work to make this card good. Last but certainly not least is Sanguine Reveler. This is the card that I think Unwilling Sacrifice really wanted to be. If you play this as a 1-mana 3/3, which is able to pop one of your eggs, I think you're going to be really happy about this card. It does go into a pretty limited style of deck. I don't think that the average Zoo deck will want to play this card. But there is a chance that if you can go wide enough with tokens, that a card which is going to come down as the 3/3 for 1 mana is going to be worth playing inside that. So I'm excited to try this card out in a few different kinds of strategies to see what I can do with it. So looking back on Warlock, it's really difficult for me to know if they got enough. They definitely needed the most help coming out of Ungoro, and they got some good cards that are going to be able to help them. They're going to have ways to clear the board and pressure their opponent. They're getting a much needed way to deal with early minions and gain life at the same time. But when everything's said and done, I'm just not sure if there's enough tools to launch them into relevance. I think that the Blood Reaver Ghoul Dawn is oddly specific and perhaps not wide-reaching enough to bring the class back into prominence, certainly not on his own. But when you put all the tools together, there might just be a way for Warlock to cobble together at least one deck that will be able to compete in the upcoming meta. This brings us to our final class of the day, which is Warrior. Scourgelord Garrosh is a difficult one for me to evaluate, because there's a lot of different circumstances where I think this card would be either quite good or quite bad. So the weapon that it equips is pretty strong. To be able to deal damage to 3 minions simultaneously is really quite good, and I think the ability to choose which one has the lowest power and is damaging yourself the least is going to be strong. But when you're low on life, I think this card is not going to be excellent. When you're ahead or when you are at parity, I think this card is going to be pretty good. Unfortunately, for control decks, I think that the hero power is not going to be as good in certain situations as just the regular armor up. So I think there might be some situations where you can't play this card, particularly when you're behind. But when you put it all together, this is a card that's going to be pretty strong when the game is close and when you're winning. And I think it's going to do enough to warrant inclusion in some decks. We're also going to see that there's a Enrage style deck which really benefits from dealing damage to your own minions as well, and I think this is going to be an auto include in that one. As an 8-mana 4/6, Rotface would have to have a pretty strong ability for it to be able to see play, and I think it does have a pretty strong ability. To be able to not just draw, but to summon a random legendary minion is very strong. I think if you summon one legendary minion, on average, you're not going to be happy with it. Obviously, you might get a really, really good legendary, but there's also quite a few pretty dumpy ones. If you summon 2, that should be enough to be very happy with this effect. So which decks does this go into? I don't think Control is going to be happy enough with this card unless they have a pretty large number of ways to deal damage to it. But I do think that in the Enrage deck, this is going to be really, really quite strong. So perhaps in a more controlling style Enrage deck, Rotface could be a very key card. Dead Man's Hand is a fun card, but I think it's just a little too niche and a little too bad in too many scenarios to see any kind of wide play. If the meta somehow becomes extremely fatigue-oriented meta, then seeing this as a one-of isn't completely unreasonable. And there is something you can do where if you have 2 of this in your hand and 1 strong card, you can shuffle Dead Man's Hand and that card back into your deck as the last 2 cards into your deck to draw the strong card every other turn. You would probably only want to have that card be 6 mana, though, because you'll need to cast Dead Man's Hand in that card while it's in your hand at the same time, and you'll also want to hero power. So if that does come up, I would probably be surprised, but that's the only way that I could really see to make use of this card. Bring It On was a card that I didn't really like on first glance, but now that I think about it, I think there will be a couple of situations where control decks would be interested in playing this card. This is definitely not the sort of card that you just want to run out there on turn 2. if you reduce the cost of more than one minion and you play this, it's going to be quite bad. But I think when you're getting into the sort of mid to late game stages and you're being pressured by an opponent, a control deck will be interested in playing this card to be able to kind of hang in the game, kind of in the same way that Druid decks play Earthen Scales to hang into a game. So I think if you use this correctly, this could be a good tool in control decks. But other than that, I don't think that more mid-rangey or aggressive strategies are going to be interested in this one at all. As a 3-mana 4/3, Mountain Fire Armor does not need a very good ability to see some play, but I really don't think that the ability on this card is going to be strong enough to kind of give it that extra boost to be played in some decks. I basically view this as strictly an anti-aggro tool. I don't think that you really want this against mid-range or against control decks, and I think aggro decks are going to be able to play around its Death Rattle ability often enough that this won't be a big problem for them. I think you might be better off playing something like Tar Creeper as an anti-aggro tool. This next card seems excellent in the Enraged deck. In fact, it might be so good that it's the reason to play the Enraged deck. If you get one trigger off of this, I think you're going to be quite happy with the fact that you paid 3 mana for a 1/4 and a 2/2. And if you get 2 or more triggers off of this, then you are absolutely doing it. All of the Enrage effects that already exist for Warrior and will exist thanks to this set, I think will be more than enough to make this a highly playable card. Death Revenant is an Enraged card that I think will just take a little bit too much setup to be consistently good. If you can consistently play this as a 5-mana 6/6, then it's certainly passable. If this is a 7/7 or an 8/8, then it's amazing. But I think to be able to ensure that you're doing that, you would need to be playing not only with an Enraged deck, but against a deck that is going to be putting out a pretty decent number of minions. You would also have to keep these minions alive and long enough to get a big trigger from this, and in the meantime, they're likely to be causing you problems if they're sitting around and staying alive. So I think this card just requires a little bit too much to go right for it to be good, for me to be interested in it. Our first common is Animated Berserker, which is pretty straightforward to analyze. I think it will be a very key enabler in the Enraged deck, and it's absolutely actively terrible in every other deck. So there you go. Forge of Souls is another 2-mana draw 2, the second one that we're seeing in this set. I think the big difference between this card, though, and Ice Fishing, which draws you Murlocs, is that it's very easy to construct a Murloc deck which has enough Murlocs to be able to consistently draw 2 cards from an effect like this. However, there aren't really any current decks in the metagame which run enough weapons to be able to consistently support Forge of Souls. The other issue is that weapons don't really stack as well as other card types do. You can only have one in play at the same time. To play a second weapon is to kill the weapon you currently have in play. So even though I am a fan of drawing 2 cards at the same time for only 2 mana, I don't think that Forge of Souls is going to be able to find a home in the new metagame. And that brings us to our final class card, which is Bloodraiser. This card has Battlecry and Death Rattle of dealing 1 damage to all minions. So it seems like a clear fit for the Enraged deck, and I do think in that deck it's going to be pretty strong. The question is this strong enough to make its way into mid-range decks? And I think the answer is no. I think that dealing 1 damage to all of your minions, in addition to theirs, is going to be enough of a setback that if you're not interested in dealing damage to your own minions, that you're probably not going to be interested in playing this card. Warrior in Knights of the Frozen Throne is very interesting because really all of their playable cards are geared towards this new Enraged deck, and I think this new Enraged deck is going to be good. I think it will be playable. I think combined with old cards that go well into it and these new ones, we're going to have a real deck on our hands. With that said, I don't think that they really got many tools which are going to be playable in existing decks, just some fairly niche ones that are going to make a minor impact. So if you're looking forward to playing an Enraged style deck, then you're probably going to be excited about what's in store for you in the new set. But if you are hoping for some tools to improve on your old Warrior decks, I think you might be a little bit disappointed outside of perhaps the new Death Knight card. And that will wrap up our review of all the class cards. I'll see you guys soon for our review of the neutrals.